What's the purpose of depression and worthless sentiments? Our worth is infinite, hope is within. We're potent kin, but they dope us with sins. The only reason for living is to grow and envision the scope of our givens. Breathe and kiss the ethers, kindred, we're so limitless. I read this for Ithra like I'm speaking the Gita. Kama from Nila, Rama and Sita. That's the basis of hoping, like sand paintings from Hopis, the Tibetan monks. I flick each mala bead from the blessed stump of a tree. Reach the bliss of Tara's being, leave Mara's regions and Samsara's demons. Samskara breeds karma, but I'm Harik teachings from Jaz Rastas free me. I'm a beacon to the needy like Pratyahara from Kalachakra Tantra. Om Shanti is my mantra. My flows glow with yantras like smoking ganja. Hope comes from Chaitanya, not from Shaitan. Don't be slaves and pawns to your graves.
Hope is what makes us strong.
The temple man, or you are the temple that is referred to in the scripture. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:19 and in 2 Corinthians 6:16, that we learn that man's body is the temple or house of God. Now, in the days of old, Moses pitched a tent or a tabernacle that resembled man, or the head of man. And in the latter days, Solomon built a temple in the likeness of man. And remember that the Most High ordered Moses to make the tabernacle specifically as he had heard in the mount, according to the heavenly pattern. And so we see this heavenly pattern in the semblance of a man. Even the the Hebrew lettering of the name Yahweh, if manipulated, resembles a man. So the Temple of Solomon and the tabernacle were symbols and objective lessons of the true tabernacle that God pitched, but not man. See, man pitched these temples and tabernacles, but the one that God pitched is a temple not made with hands, as testified to in the so-called New Testament. And when he says after the likeness of heaven, it's not speaking of somewhere up in space. It's speaking of a higher realm within man. The real temple is a permanent dwelling, although man's body is not even permanent, but man's body is not made with hands. So you have to go through levels to understand the Creator, or most people do. Some can get it instantly. So in the first Temple of Solomon, there was the first court, or the outer court, for the nations, or those who wanted to hear the words of spiritual life. But the Gentiles were not allowed to enter into the inner court. Those were for those who were of religious vows, or the Israelites. These two, even inner courts, or inner court and outer court, represents two states of mentalities. The outer, still seeking, and the inner court are those who are on the path. So in the inner court, there was an altar for sacrificing. And every person who came to worship was expected to bring an offering of a kid, a dove, or a goat, oxen, things of this nature. On this altar were burnt offerings of all kinds. And this is a representation of sacrificing the animalistic ways, not in the literal sense as they sacrificed. You see, they sacrificed sacrifices that were pure or unblemished. Well, the ultimate pure sacrifice that represents is the sacrifice of yourself, holy, in order to go beyond the veil. So we must sacrifice our animalistic ways, which mankind who is without God seems to dwell in, and it seems to be normality. So there must be a change of mind and a relinquishment of the ways of the senses. And so in Solomon's temple, there was also in the inner court a brazen sea, which was a representation, or it had 12 oxen holding up a pool of water, which also symbolizes the purity of the water in or held within the animalistic way. The 12 beasts are holding a bowl of water. The water represents the purity of the spirit, and the beast represents the flesh. And in Solomon's temple, there was also the arms, and they had 10 fingers, 5 lavers on each side, which were where cleansings were done. Well, this was where the priests would go and cleanse things in themselves, representing your hands being cleansed. So these are all symbols before you even get to the holy place. So after the step of sacrificing, which represents sacrificing yourself, but they did it outwardly because these are divine ordinances, meaning these are divine symbols to get you to see something deeper. But most people who read scriptures only take the literal and think this is what must be done. But you have to look deeper. So after the sacrifices and cleansing, one enters into the holy place. And here is the menorah, the shewbread, and the incense, which the menorah represents the light of the spirit. The shewbread is a symbol of the substance of the Creator, or of God, or of that which is the substance within you that never changes, which many are blinded by because the veil is still up. Even though they could read many of scriptures, that veil is still up. But there is something in you that doesn't change. The you that you, when you were 5 years old, and the you that you are today is the same being. But the changes of the body, of the mind, of your character have come and gone. There's not a single particle in you from 7 years ago that exists today, because all these things regenerate and change. But you still feel you, because you are that which never changes. You are not your mind. You are not your body. You are that which is the Holy of Holies, but a veil has been put up, which we'll read about, where you don't see it. You think you are the things that are outer. And so, the manna, and that's what Christ said, the manna that Moses gave you, that which decayeth is not that true manna. Christ said, I am that true manna. Christ is a representation of that which dwells within you, or that high priest that goes into the Holy of Holies. You are that high priest. But you have to have something outer to point you to it. That's why many run to laws, statutes, and commandments, because they're necessary for something outer to show you what is inner. And then you have the altar of incense, which is a symbol most people know of prayer. But prayer is not something you do when you just prostrate and collapse your hands together and say words. Prayer is a constant dwelling on this spirit that is already in you, which cannot be touched, which is pure in itself. A constant dwelling. Your every walk, you should be dwelling on that. This is what prayer represents. So, after you enter into the holy place, there is a veil. And once you go behind the veil, this is the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is, where the ways of God dwell, right? The ways of God. And in this place, it is said that this is where God dwells, which is another symbol for the human. See, behind the veil, or the veil symbolizes the mind, but I hear a lot of people teach, when they teach this, that behind the veil is the mind. No, your minds are where your thoughts, your memories, your images come in. This is your mind. You can have a thought of evil and a thought of good. This is the veil that veils you. Even when you say, I am a human, this is a thought that occurs in the mind. And this is what veils you from seeing the Holy of Holies. The mind is the veil. Behind the veil dwells the anointing, or the Christ, or where God dwells. These are all synonymous words. So, by observation, we could see that man was being educated by these symbols of temples and tabernacles to a more perfect way, which is within man. And these are how all the feasts are. Maybe I'll break that down later. How all the feasts in the Bible are. They are symbols of man's regeneration. This is why this is a spiritual book. But you'll hear a lot of people who dwell in the law condemn people for not keeping this, not keeping that, which these are symbols of something greater. And this is what Christ came to teach. And so, in the book of 2 Thessalonians, chapter 1, verse 8, he reads, he shall mete out retribution on those who ignore God and pay attention to the gospel of our Lord Jesus. And they will pay the penalty of everlasting ruin away from the presence of the Lord. And the presence is behind the veil. And again, I said our veil is the mind, right? And this is why it says when Christ died, he rent the veil in two. Because in order, when you die, when you sacrifice yourself, not physically die, but when you die while you're living, the veil of all your thoughts are rent. Everything you've learned, it was like learned ignorance. Because you see reality once your mind merges into its source, which is your essence or your awareness or your light that lights up the mind. The mind is known to something. Your thoughts are known to something. What is that? Find out what that is. Can you turn your mind around and see what it is known to? When you see that light of pure knowing that knows the thoughts, knows your feelings, knows the reins of your heart, your mind melts into that and no longer exists I wouldn't say no longer, because for a while it begins to dissipate. But after a while, your mind melts into that which it is, which is the pure awareness of God, or the pure being of God. And so it says, they will pay the penalty of everlasting ruin away from the presence of the Lord and from his glorious power, whenever he comes to have his glory shown in his saints. See, where is his glory shown? Not in the tabernacle made with hands, but in the tabernacle made by God, in the bodies of his saints. Because the veil has been rent, or the mind has been rent, and that which gave life to the mind is seen and shines forth through the mind, through the body, through the senses. And so, in Hebrews chapter 8, it spells this out. The holies of holies is where God dwells, and it's symbolic of the head, because this is where most of us think we live, behind our eyes. But even this is just a pointing, because when you really see the true light of the Spirit, all things dwell in you. It's not that God dwells in a body, but this body dwells in God. But Hebrews 8 says, verse 1, now the main point of what we have been saying is this: we have such an high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, as administrator of things holy, yes, of the real tabernacle, which not a man, but the Lord pitched. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. So this one too must have something to present. If then he were still on earth, he would not be a priest of all. For here they offer the gifts as prescribed by law, that serves as a copy and shadow of heavenly things, just as Moses was instructed when about to build the complete tabernacle. Okay. In verse 6 it says, but now he has acquired a ministry as far superior as the covenant he mediates is better, enacted as it is upon more excellent promises. Okay, not the promises of sacrificing bulls and goats, but of the sacrificing of yourself. And the only reason you believe yourself is because you believe the thoughts of your mind. And this is why Christ's main message was to lose your life, take up your cross, crucifixion, baptism, kill yourself, kill the idea of yourself, and you will truly see the light that shines on the world, that gives not only light to the sun, but to the moon, but lights up darkness. That is your very essence. See, you cannot be a tree because you know a tree, or you see a tree, but you also see your body. To know something, you have to be apart from it. To see something, you have to be apart from it. To see your feelings come and go, you have to be apart from it. When your feeling of anger comes, you see it. When it leaves, a piece of you doesn't leave with it. So that cannot be you. These are just visitors. So let me hop down to chapter 9. It says, for the first covenant had to be sure. For the first covenant had to be sure its worship, regulations, and its earthly sanctuary. For the tabernacle was thus furnished in what is called the holy place, where the lampstand and the table and the presentation of the loaves. Behind the second curtain was the tent called the Holy of Holies, contained the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant, completely covered with gold. Inside it, the golden jar of manna, Aaron's rod sprouted, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the mercy seat, about which we cannot go into detail. With these things so arranged, the priests were always entered the first tent to conduct divine services. So they went into the first tent to conduct divine services, meaning sacrifices, offerings. And these are the same things. But you see, even these divine services, the high priest or the priests have not went behind the second veil. And so a lot of people in spiritual life stay in this first place, the holy place. They'll offer sacrifices, but they still haven't communed with God or been one with God yet because the veil is still up. They believe they are doing the works, right? It says, but into the second, the high priest alone enters once a year, not without blood, which he offers for himself and for the thoughtless sins of the people. Through this, the Holy Spirit evidences that the way into the holiest was not yet disclosed, with the first tent still standing. This was a symbol for that current time at which those gifts and offerings were presented, cannot render the worshiper's conscience perfect, as they consist only of food and drinks and various ablutions, physical regulations, and maintained until the time of rectification. And he goes on to say, but when Christ arrived as the high priest of promised blessings, he passed through the greater or more perfect tent, not made with hands, no part, that is, of man's creation, not with blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. And blood only represents his life, through his own life. Because if his life wasn't pure, or if he did not, as it says in Philippians, empty himself of himself, then that sacrifice or that blood would mean nothing. Sacrificing yourself is the symbol. You have to sacrifice yourself in order to be filled with the Spirit. As long as yourself is there, that Spirit cannot fill you. So he entered into the holy place once and for all, procuring eternal redemption. And so when this rent is veiled, or the mind, because the mind is not the holy of holies. The mind, let me give you a symbol. It's like the sky. You could have white, beautiful clouds, which represents good mental thoughts, and then you have dark, stormy clouds, which represent evil thoughts. This is the mind. But that which is beyond the mind is the sky. That is beyond the blue sky, that is above or beyond the mind, that is untouched by the good thoughts or the bad thoughts. This is what you also have in you. Something that is beyond your thoughts, that can look down and see your thoughts of good and evil. And when you rest in that which is the sky, or which is your consciousness, you will find peace. You will find righteousness. You will find joy. You will find purity. That these things, these dark clouds and these bright clouds, no longer hold sway over you. And then the veil begins to rent in two. And you will see these things no longer have power over you. And that awareness or brightness begins to shine through the vessel you call your body and into the world. And you will find out that everything is made of this spirit or consciousness, to where you can no longer hate it, because it is you. It is one and the same thing. And this is what the temple and the tabernacle were trying to get man to see. A new heaven and a new earth while you're still living. Not, we're still looking for an outward new heaven and new earth, but while you're still living, this renewed sense of life where you're no longer seeking, but you have abundance because you're no longer in need. Only human beings are in need. But this, which you truly are, you're truly the sky, but you take yourself to be the dark clouds and the white clouds. But once the mind is rent, or that veil is rent, that keeps you from this purity, until that happens, you can never fully understand the symbolism of the temple and the tabernacle. So with that, I'll say peace.